Hi everyone. So this past May, I had the cliche New York experience of getting kicked out of my apartment because the landlord raised the rent. Fortunately, it did leave me with this cool project idea, and I decided that I would research some of the phenomena behind the surge in housing prices throughout New York City. But before we start to look at my findings, I want to first draw your attention to these columns right over here, and I want to show you that they are all in a pivot table friendly format, right? So as I was looking for the data relating to New York City housing, I was pulling tons of information from the US Census, from the American Community Survey, and from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. And the information which you can see right here in peach, it was all good, it was all relevant, but the problem was a lot of times it wasn't formatted in the way that I needed, right? So one solution that I came up with was this function right here, right? And so it is essentially, it is a VLOOKUP function nested inside of an if-then statement. And what this function allowed me to do is it allowed me to look for this value right here, right? This was my lookup value, negative 11,971, within this table right here. And if that value came up, which of course it would because it's in the table, then my if statement would place the correct label from column 1 within this function, within this cell. At that point, I was able to just copy it down, and as you can see, it did all the work for me. So that was really useful. Now, before we go to the dashboard, I want to just bring you over here to the supply of housing. And now, if you want to start to address why New York City housing prices are starting to go through the roof and the corresponding renting prices, you're really going to look at two things. You're going to look at the demand for housing, and you're going to look at the supply for housing. Now, the supply for housing was definitely a lot easier to look at because there are a lot fewer variables, right? There's the total number of houses, and there's the number of vacant houses. And that's pretty much what this graph sums up. The main thing you should take away is how little the total housing has changed in the last 4 years. Right, so you can see right here, this blue bar, that it barely moves. The other really important thing to take away from this is the rental vacancy rate, which we have right here. And this hovers at just 2.25%, right? This is a combo graph, so we're going to look at the right-hand y-axis, and we can see that there is, that it's only at 2.25%. Now, if you own an apartment, and the only thing that's going to make you lower the price of that apartment is if it's going to sit empty at the price that you currently have it. So since that isn't happening, there's going to have to be a decrease in demand in order for prices to come down. And this leads us to our dashboard. Now, right here, we have New York City wealth distribution by quintile and year. So when I was trying to figure what variables would influence the price of housing, the first one that came to my mind was, well, how much money does everyone have, right? And this is what this diagram is supposed to represent. Now, one of the issues that you might take with this dashboard is that it has way too much information, right? But that's kind of one of the advantages of using a dashboard. When you have a dashboard, you can have this diagram that has all this information, and then you can slice that information to start to look for trends in more depth. And so now let's begin to slice the data, right? Let's say I want to look at just the 5th and 1st quartile to compare the two groups that are most different in New York City. And you can see this, the length of the bars right here is going to give you a pretty bird's eye view of the wealth distribution within New York City. Right, so on the right here, we have this group having nearly all of the wealth, and over here we have most of our bars are pointing downwards, which means that they have more debt than they have assets. But the other striking thing that I want to point out is that you can see right here that most of these bars move up from 2000 to 2011 for the 5th quintile, but for the 1st quintile that doesn't really happen, right? There's in fact almost no bars that are above ground on this left-hand side. And so it shows you that things aren't just bad, but they might be moving in the wrong direction. But even this is just one way to slice the data. So now I'm going to show you a different one. And instead of, say, comparing the different quintiles like we can right here, I'm going to start to slice the data based on the age cohorts, right? So I'm going to include all 5 of my quintiles, just like that. And then I'm going to come over here and I want to compare instead those groups, those individuals who are under 35 to those who are 75 and over. And what we see here is not only that the last 11 years have been better for those in the 5th quintile than in the lower quintiles, but also that it has been much better for those in the older age cohorts than for those in the younger age cohorts, right? So even if you were lucky enough to be in the 5th quintile, you can see that during those 11 years, your demographic age group didn't increase in wealth over that time. And if you were in the 1st quintile during that period, your wealth actually went down. And that's a really important point that I want to highlight individually right now. If you were in the first quintile during this time period, for those under 35, they actually increase in debt, right? So a lot of this might be student debt or other forms of unforgivable debt, but it nearly doubles during this time period. And in fact, that same quintile doesn't break even in net worth until the age of 55 to 64 years. So that is a pretty dramatic increase, or decrease, I guess, during that time period. And now I want to take us to the rent prices for New York City by borough and year, right? So this is the result of that supply of housing and partly the result of the wealth distribution, right? And so what this is going to break down to is what we see right here. But you have to be careful, right? Because when you're this zoned out, you can actually see a lot of the more nuanced patterns that are happening. So let's begin to slice this information just a little bit. If I look at just from $200 to $750, right, I can notice a very discernible pattern that the blue bars, or the $500 to $750 range, are beginning to decrease across 4 of the 5 boroughs. Right, that's something that you would expect in a borough that is gentrifying, is for these lower price rents to decrease. Notice though that the $200 to $500 rents don't decrease. Those are probably publicly subsidized and not going anywhere. Yeah, this is something that you might want to think of if you're going to rent your apartment in New York City as well, right? To get an idea of how much that you should be expecting to pay. But similarly, if we now also slice the data instead by the 2 most expensive categories, we can see a similar story of gentrification, but just the flip side, right? So here we have the rental units that are worth more than $1,500. And we can see that those units increase for 4 of the 5 boroughs, right? Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Manhattan all have those raising blue bars. But what we can also see is that that increase isn't all equal. Brooklyn and Manhattan clearly have the quickest acceleration of these 2 categories. It should also be noted, though, that the category only goes up to $1,500 or more, right? So if you were to instead have a category for $2,000 or $3,000, there might be a difference in acceleration that you don't see here. Now, finally, the last chart that I want to show you is the zones out, right? So instead of looking at just the New York City, it's going to take into account all of the United States and the income distribution. And now the first thing I want to point to you on this chart is down here, which is the year. And so we can see that it starts from 1967 and goes all the way to 2014, which is a much longer time span than our dashboard charts had. So if we wanted to really compare the 2, we would only look from 1997 to 2014. And the important part of that is we can see that the distribution of income during this time period doesn't change that dramatically, right? If we look at these yellow bars right here, or these gray bars right here, we can see that they mostly stay the same. And since they mostly stay the same, that begs the question of why there was such a dramatic change in wealth from 2000 to 2011 in New York City. And that could be because, and it would only suggest it wouldn't necessarily prove it, that the phenomenon of inequality is more exacerbated inside the city than it is throughout the entire country. So yeah, just something to keep in mind whether you're renting an apartment or even looking to buy one. I thought it was interesting, and I hope you did too. Thanks.